Today, so for those of you who don't know about the National Center for Science Education, we're a nonprofit based in Oakland, just up the bay a bit, and we defend evolution in public schools. As of last month, we also deal with climate change because a lot of the same sorts of challenges that we're used to seeing around evolution have been coming up around climate change education as well. The graphic there is from the first Miss America pageant, actually. I believe here on the left is the first Miss America. And there's sort of an interesting history with evolution and pageants that I'm not going to get into in any sort of detail, but they started out as from this in the early 20th century there was this idea of eugenics that you could breed more perfect humans, and which was this misapplication of evolutionary theory, right? And pageants were part of how that was expressed. This was like, find the ideal woman and then find the ideal man, and you mate them together, and pretty soon you've got an ideal society or something, which has a lot of flaws with it, right? But this was the idea that was current at the time. So this was 1921, not how Miss America necessarily looks today, or dresses today. And over the last, I'll just talk a little bit about what we've been seeing around attacks on evolution we've been seeing lately. This is in Concord, New Hampshire. The state legislature, there was a bill introduced that would roll back the teaching of evolution. Representative, citing the horrors of the Columbine school shooting and the atrocities of Nazi Germany, said that New Hampshire students should be taught the religious and philosophical background underpinnings of any theory that's taught in public schools. So as a way to try to attack evolution. There was another bill, one of two bills like this that were introduced in the legislature attacking evolution. In Missouri, there have been a couple bills introduced. This one by Representative Bratton requires teaching both sides of disputed issues in an objective manner. And he insists that this is not about religion. He just says evolution is not a proven fact. So keeping competing ideas about the origin of humanity, like intelligent design, out of the classroom is wrong. In Indiana, there were a couple of bills just last month introduced. One of them that would require the teaching of creation science in classrooms, which is an idea that we haven't really heard about since the 80s. So, good times. And this actually passed the state Senate. It was amended in various ways, but his goal there was to go back to revisit a 1987 Supreme Court case that struck down the teaching of creation science, and by doing so to undermine the broader church-state separation holdings of the Supreme Court over the years. And there have also been bills in Virginia, in Oklahoma, and I may be forgetting, I feel like there was a sixth state where anti-evolution legislation has been introduced just this year. Last year there were, I think, 11 or 12 bills that were introduced around the country. So it's a persistent problem. And these survey data that I've got up here, you can't really see the red line there, but this is data that Gallup has been gathering since the early 1980s, where they ask people what they think about the origin of humankind. Is at the top you have that humans developed, but with God guiding the process, and that's been hanging in there around 44% consistently for 30 some odd years. Below that you have the idea that God created man in his present form less than 6,000 or less than 10,000 years ago. That hangs in there around 38% pretty consistently for the last 30 years. And then at the bottom, the idea that humans developed over time, over millions of years, but then that God had no part in the process, has been rising sort of steadily from about 9% in the early 80s to about 14 or 15% today, which is, it's nice to see change, but that's pretty modest change when you get down to it. It's a quarter point or half point per year, so, in a couple centuries, we'll be there, right? And I mean, this is sort of, this is where these bills come from, right? The fact that there is this persistent and nearly unchanging anti-evolution strain, certainly through all of the public polling data that we've got going back to the 80s and probably going back well before that. You see the same thing from other surveys. This is data released by the National Science Board, which asks people true or false, humans developed from earlier species, and again, hanging in around 40% consistently since the mid-'80s. And sometimes people look at that Gallup data and they say, well, look, 40% of people endorsed this idea of young Earth creationism, the idea that humans were created less than 10,000 years ago. You can't really see it there, but up around 80%, there's a red line that says that a question in that same survey asking whether continents have moved over millions of years, and 80% of people agree with that. So the idea of continental drift in general. So how people answer these surveys is not necessarily totally consistent, and they're not necessarily, the Gallup question puts a bunch of things in together. It's evolution, it's the age of the Earth, it's humans, it's God, and what people are necessarily responding to is they're not necessarily endorsing all of it, but that's the one that's closest to their view. So, clearly no more than 20% of people, if the continental drift question is to be believed, could possibly reject absolutely the idea that the Earth is millions of years old, right? And the encouraging thing from the National Science Board records is that you do see change in some of these, at least. When you compare from the early 80s to today, how many people understand that antibiotics don't kill viruses, which is, again, an important concept for evolutionary ideas that, where antibiotic resistance comes from and so forth, why that's important. You do see change there. So public education campaigns can work, but don't always for some of these. And the topic today is going to be really why that happens. Why are people's attitudes on evolution so consistent over time? And why is the United States such an outlier with respect to the rest of the world? These are data from 2006, and the blue section of it shows how many people accept evolution, basically taking that same question that the National Science Board uses. And you can find the United States way out there, 33rd out of 34 countries, ahead of Turkey, but behind scientific powerhouses like Cyprus. This is clearly not where we want to be, but there's something this says that's unique about what's happening in the United States relative to comparable countries. This is the European Union, Japan. Something weird is going on in the United States. So what's up with that? And what I'm going to show you is the problem with polls is that the phrasing of the question matters a lot. Subtle changes in what you say. Do you say humans or do you just say animals? Which animals do you use? Do you talk about millions of years? Do you put a time frame on it at all? Do you use Darwin's name? Do you use the word evolve rather than develop? All of this changes the results that you get from survey to survey. So people, even though there is a very a consistent signal in those polls, not a lot of motion in those polls, people's minds are clearly not made up in some sense, that those subtle changes in wording matter a lot. So last spring, there was a news report that the Miss USA pageant contestants were upset because they had been sort of ambushed by this question, should evolution be taught in schools? And they felt like they were going to just be, torn apart no matter what was going to happen. It was going to be this horrible thing. But they released the video of all of their answers, and I found it fascinating because it's essentially a national focus group on how people respond to the idea of evolution. And so, Miss USA or pageant contestants are not necessarily, some of them may have studied evolution, some of them may have studied biology, but they're not experts. They're chosen through some sort of some sort of process to represent their state, but not to represent their state on scientific or educational or policy issues. So it's probably a pretty good sense of where the public is coming from in general. And these are just sort of unscripted, spontaneous responses to the idea of evolution in schools. So this runs about 15 minutes, and if I can borrow a mic, so you can listen along with me. You'll get the picture of how there's sort of consistent themes that run through this. So I'll let you I'll talk about it afterwards, but I'll let you just listen to what they have to say. Can you hear that at all? Is this mic up? Oh. Here, let's try this again. Oh.
No, I do not believe in evolution. Nope. I do not think it should be taught in schools. And
I think it's necessary that evolution is taught in schools because it is part of our history and the belief system that the West has held for a long amount of time. However, personally, I don't believe in evolution. I believe that each one of us were created for a purpose by God.
Yeah, it's all the way up. Test. Yeah. Testing.
I think it's good to provide our students with both sides of the story and let them choose for themselves.
Is that all?
I know that some people obviously believe in evolution, some people believe in creation. I think that teaching both of those and letting the students decide, whether it be on their faith or their personal beliefs, I think that's the best choice.
I think evolution, personally, I never was taught evolution in school. It was never a big focal point in our studies. But, you know, every school is different, and if that's something that they think that they need to teach their children, then that's, you know, to each his own. And so I can't argue with that.
Yeah.
Well, I was taught evolution in my high school growing up, and I do believe in it. I mean, I'm a huge science geek, so I like to believe in, like, the Big Bang Theory and, you know, the evolution of humans, you know, throughout, you know, time.
I think that we should definitely open up to offering different ways to teach students about everything, different thought processes, different ideas, because it's important to let students just decide their own ideas and what they want to believe in. So if it's something that they do teach, I think we should teach it.
That makes it complicated to talk about what they were saying. But
I do think evolution should be taught in schools.
Yeah.
I think evolution should be taught in schools, but in particular high school. It's a growing process.
Does that work at all?
Everyone needs to, you know, learn these experiences on their own and not just based off of parents' beliefs. And if they can choose and opt to take it, then that should be an option. So I think that's definitely a great idea. I definitely think that evolution should be taught in schools because I think it's important to see a difference in perspectives to actually be able to formulate your own opinion. Evolution should be taught in school. It's something that, you know, people do believe in. It is in existence, and we really don't know where the first person came from.
I think that kids need to have a wide variety of things, not just be taught one or the other. I think evolution should be taught, but I also think that maybe the biblical stuff should be taught as well. You know, I think kids need to make their own decisions. We're smarter than ever these days, so, I mean, why not teach everything and let people make their own decisions?
I think evolution should be taught in schools. We have creationism and a lot of other ideas and opinions that are taught to the children. I think everybody should be able to have their opinion taught. However, I think as the parents and the family, you should be able to be there for the children to guide them and what their beliefs are as a family and as individuals.
I believe that evolution should be mentioned in school. The thing is, it's all about what you believe in, and it shouldn't be pushed on you, but again, you should be knowledgeable about it. I guess just different options, because growing up in a family, you learn to live off of those values and morals, and if you don't have other options to believe in, that's where you're gonna go by for the rest of your life.
That's really interesting. I think evolution should be taught in schools because it is information that should be available to students. It is a theory that people should know about.
I think we should leave that up to the government. I'm not sure. I think a lot of people would have an issue if evolution was taught in school. I think we should just leave that up. I took evolution in college, and I really enjoyed it because it helped me gain perspective. And I just believe that everyone should have equal opportunity in education. So if it is available, it could be available as an elective, I think.
I think evolution should be at least introduced or exposed to students. But I think it's up to the student to either take it in and decide if they want to apply it to their life or not.
I honestly don't think you could ever have too much knowledge on any subject. That's my personal view. But I do feel that evolution shouldn't be taught in school just because there's so many different views on it. So
so many different definitions. Like, how do you teach a child the true meaning of evolution when so many different cultures have their different beliefs and scientists have their different theories? It's just not a good subject that I feel everyone will agree on in classrooms when kids come from all different backgrounds, different cultures, different beliefs. So I just personally don't think it's a good topic for school subjects at all.
I think so. You know, it's just, oh God, that's kind of a tough one. Yeah, I think so.
That's a very difficult question. I feel that we should have evolution taught in schools, as well as a belief in faith. I believe that people should be able to choose what they believe in, and that is something that I was taught in elementary school, and it hasn't hurt what I believe in. It's important.
I think that everything should be taught in school. I think the great thing about America is that we're open to freedom of choice, freedom of religion, and I think if you are going to teach one aspect of how you think the world has come to be, I think you should teach all the aspects. So evolution is definitely one. You know, it's a great theory. It's something that has really helped us evolve as people, to use the word, but I definitely think it should be. I do think evolution should be taught in schools. I was personally taught evolution growing up, even in a religious school. I think it's an important aspect, and I think it's good because it broadens your horizons. I think any learning possibility is good, and I think people should learn as much as possible about different aspects of different, whether it's religion, whether it's whatever it is. I think the more learning you can get, the more educated you are, and the more educated you are, the better you come off.
I do believe that evolution should be taught in schools. I think it's silly to not know both sides, and it would be ignorant if it's not. So yes.
Yes, I do. I think it should be. I grew up Catholic, so that's a great question if evolution should be taught in schools. But I think it's important that you understand all perspectives before making up your own decision. And I did learn from my priest growing up that evolution does not go against the Catholic faith. And Pope John Paul II did accept the idea of evolution into your Catholic practice as well. Evolution should be taught as what it is. It's a theory, so I don't think it should be taught as fact, but I do think our children should know the theories that are involved in it.
That is such a tough one. I think that if it were to be taught in schools, that would give kids a chance to decide what they want to believe for themselves. So that way, if they learned about all sorts of different ideas, then they would be able to form their own opinions afterwards.
I think that it should definitely be presented as an option, and I think that both sides should be presented and that the students should be able to make their own choices and come to their own statements.
I think that in public schools, you have to give all credited theories equal amount of time, so I think creation and evolution should both be able to be taught.
I think evolution definitely should be taught in schools. I think there's different ways to view evolution, but as everyone can probably agree upon, everything evolves. We evolve as communities that build ourselves from scratch, and Nevada's a good example of that, that we've evolved from a very small community to something much, much bigger and much more successful. So I think evolution can be taught in many different ways. It doesn't necessarily have to be about people and how people have evolved, but it can also be about communities as well.
You know, I work in a hospital setting with children and families, and I am constantly trying to provide interactions and interventions as a child life specialist that is culturally respective and sensitive to all points of view. So I think that evolution is one of those things that needs to be incorporated, but it shouldn't be the only point of view taught. I think everything should be taught in schools, every single aspect of evolution, anything you can think of. I think they should have the option of learning everything that there is to learn, and then kind of choose what they like to believe.
I think evolution should be taught in schools because evolution is based off of science, and I think science is a huge thing that we need to continue to enrich our schools with.
I personally believe evolution should be taught in schools, and I believe that religion should be taught in schools. I think that everything should be taught in schools, and that knowledge is power, and it's good for all of our students to have a wider perspective of different beliefs and important things that a lot of people, that's scientific, and as well as what other cultures practice.
great to get both sides of the story. I'm personally a Christian, so I believe the Bible's version, but you can't push opinions or beliefs on children, so they need to know every side that's out there. So yes, I do believe that should be taught, but so should the other side of the story.
Sure, why not? Evolution should be taught in schools. I think it's good that people hear both sides of, I guess, the story, so to speak.
You know what? I think why not? Because I think it just gives the youth right now in America, why not keep their options open? You don't necessarily have to agree with it, but I'm not opposed to it.
I do think evolution should be taught in schools. I think it's important to teach young people kind of every version of everything and a little bit of everything so they can form their own opinions. I think that's really important.
I think that every theory of how we came to be here should get a shout out in the education. So evolution definitely should be presented, but I think other options should be presented alongside it. It shouldn't be the only one.
I think evolution should absolutely be taught in schools. I think we should explore all philosophies. So evolution should be taught and other theories should be taught as well. And then children should be taught as much as possible so that they can decide on their own what they think is the truth.
I believe evolution should be taught in schools because I think that kids need to know all different perspectives on how the world came to be.
I think, whether people believe in creation or evolution, everyone needs to know how we were made, why we're here, and I think, if the parents are fine with it, then that's okay.
I think evolution is part of basic science and it should be taught, but I also don't think that teachers or anyone should step on the toes of biblical values either. I do think evolution should be taught in schools. Personally, that's not my belief, but I think that all ideas should be put out there for people to decide for themselves.
I wouldn't see why evolution couldn't be taught in schools. I think it's something that, again, it would be the school's preference, but I think it'd be interesting to learn about, just have something extra for kids to know about.
Oh, it's tough because everybody has their different beliefs. Gosh, I don't know. I would say yes, but I know some people are going to be offended by it. It's tough. It's one of those things that I think, either way, somebody's going to be offended. So I would say yes, but, somebody's mad though.
I think evolution should be taught in schools because not everybody necessarily has the same religious background, and it's important to have scientific facts about the world. And we do know that evolution exists even on a small scale, like with people and with bacteria that are becoming resistant to drugs and whatnot. So might as well learn about it.
I think little bits and pieces of evolution should be taught in schools because it is a theory. And after all, we all need to know about different theories so that we can figure out what we want to believe is true.
I think when it comes to evolution, I think science is great, and when it comes to teaching, I think facts should be stated, and we should know the facts as to how the world evolves, because it does. But as far as when it comes to little theories and whatnot, I probably want to stay away from those. I believe in the truth and the truth only, not somebody's, imagination or hope or whatnot. So I think facts, not theories, should be taught.
Yeah, I do think that evolution should be taught in schools, but I also don't think that religion should be taken out. If you don't believe in evolution, that's fine, but you should at least be informed about it. If you don't believe in religion, that's fine, but you should at least be informed about it. So I personally feel like they should incorporate both.
I feel that evolution should be taught in schools only because it's a great subject to touch base on.
Evolution's kind of a touchy subject. I took a class called biological anthropology though, and it taught the history of evolution, and it's very scientific, so I would think both should be taught in schools because you should probably know the whole story.
So there you go. So, sorry. The thing that I find noteworthy about it is how rarely the word science or scientific comes up. 9 of the 51, because the District of Columbia is in there also, so 9 of the 51 use the words science or scientific. 2 of them use the word theory correctly. So, and most of them, 20 or 30 of them, put it explicitly as a philosophy or as a religious idea and most of the others somehow talk about, yes, we should present it to balance things out. This idea that it's a topic to be balanced or a matter of personal belief, these sorts of things. And I think that it's important to think about that, because that's not how I think about it as a biologist, how I think about what evolution means. I got interested in this and trying to figure out, what explains the differences between the different responses. And so I actually sat down and transcribed the whole video. And set up a internet survey so that people, and I got about 700 responses of people who went through and rated each of them on a scale of 1 to 10. And so these are those results which are sort of interesting on their own. And for comparison, I chose statements from 5 different societies, three scientific societies and 2 creationist groups. They're sort of institutional statements about how should evolution, their answer to the same question, should evolution be taught in schools? And so at the top you've got the Society of Amateur Scientists and the American Association for the Advancement of Science, which is the publisher of Science Magazine, one of the major science journals. The Inter-Academy Panel, which is a group of national academies of sciences from around the world, 60 some odd countries. And so those all were, 9s and 10s in the average rating, way above any of the pageant contestants. And then a statement from the Discovery Institute. I'll show you what the statements actually look like. The Discovery Institute is the main proponent of intelligent design creationism, which came in around, the rating was I think 7.2, and came in ahead of all but 3 of the pageant contestants. And then at the bottom you have the Institute for Creation Research, whose statement said, look, even if we don't overtly teach creationism, at least we should present the evidence against evolution, even if people don't want to accept that that's evidence for creationism. And on the x-axis here is based on survey data where the general public was asked, do you think evolution should be taught in schools, essentially? And they were able to break that down to state level. So you have state level of support for teaching evolution on the x-axis. On the y-axis, you have the average rating among the hundreds of people who I got to rate these. And so you can see that there is actually a pretty strong correlation. It's about a 0.5 correlation, which for social science stuff is like crazy good. I wasn't really expecting it to be that strong. So in some sense, what they're saying is representative of the general public in the states that they're coming from. Not perfectly, of course, but what is. So the almost a perfect 10, the Society for Amateur Scientists saying the contemporary theory of biological evolution is one of the most robust products of scientific inquiry. It's the foundation for research in many areas of biology as well as an essential element of science education. AAAS says that evolution is the unifying principle of biology. Nothing makes sense without it. That's a paraphrase of Theodosius Dobzhansky's famous comment from that he published first in the 60s. Nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. It remains an active field of research. There are subtle questions within it to be answered. However, that life has adapted and changed through time is well established as the fact that the Earth goes around the sun. The Inter-Academy Panel says that it's important to educate all children about the methods and discoveries of science and foster an understanding of the science of nature. Knowledge of the natural world in which they live empowers peoples to meet human needs and protect the planet. The Discovery Institute says we shouldn't mandate teaching intelligent design. Evolution should be fully and completely presented to students, and they should learn more about evolutionary theory, including its unresolved issues. Providing an understanding of the strengths and weaknesses of neo-Darwinian and chemical evolutionary theories, by which they mean the origin of life. Rather than teaching an overt alternative theory, represents a common ground approach that all reasonable citizens can agree on. And so these were all posted without the affiliation in the survey. So no one knew whether a statement was made by one of the contestants or came from one of these societies. And then the Institute for Creation Research says that school boards and teachers should be encouraged to at least strengthen evidences and arguments against evolution, even if they don't wish to recognize these as evidences and arguments for creation. And so the Miss California, who became Miss USA, so hooray, and comes from San Mateo, just up the peninsula, was ranked about the same as the Discovery Institute statement. The contestants from New Mexico and Connecticut came in a lot better, and there's a sort of, a few other states did okay, and then there's a sort of general mishmash at the bottom there. Another group from Kansas, actually, wrote to me after they had done this analysis where they came up with their own rating and mapped it out. This is a little bit dark, so it's hard to read, but you can see the reddish states are the ones that are advocating for creationism or for excluding evolution at all. That's Washington, Indiana, Kentucky, Alabama. And then the greenish states are the ones that are more pro-evolution. And then the yellow in the middle, which is pretty much spread across the country without any obvious geographic pattern to it, are the people who are saying we should teach both, some version of that. And one thing that I know people who are actually curious about is trying to correlate that with the quality of state science standards, which this is an analysis that we did at NCSE a couple of years back, looking at how evolution is covered in the state science standards. And state standards are, their relationship to what actually happens in the classroom is complicated. So I wouldn't necessarily expect a huge correlation, but they should reflect the general political process and so forth. So it'd be surprising if this didn't correlate as well with the quality of the statements. One thing that also struck me about this is that what the contestants were trying to do is similar to what politicians do when they're sort of ambushed by someone in a debate and said, "What do you think about evolution? Should we teach evolution in public schools?" And you know, they're dealing with the same sort of audiences and trying to figure out, like, what does my audience want to hear, and what do I believe, and what's the community, and how people are going to respond to this. And often from politicians, you get that same sort of response. So these are just a few of the Republican candidates for president this year. Not all of them current candidates, and this is not meant to endorse or disendorse any, you know, we're a nonprofit. I'm not, you know, make your own choices about who you vote for, obviously, but this is just, you know, for comparison. So, Tim Pawlenty.
Do you think that creationism has the same weight as evolution? And at a time in American education when we are in a crisis when it comes to
This was actually 2008, so in response to something Sarah Palin had said.
Creationism versus evolution in the teaching?
In the scientific community, it seems like intelligent design is dismissed. Not entirely. There are a lot of scientists who would make the case that it is appropriate to be taught and appropriate to be demonstrated. But in terms of the curriculum in the schools in Minnesota, we've taken the approach that that's a local decision. But I know Senator Palin, or Governor Palin, has said intelligent design is something that she thinks should be taught along with evolution in the schools, and I think that's appropriate from my standpoint. But my personal view is that's a local decision.
Given equal weight.
Local school board.
And you would recommend it be given equal weight?
We've said in Minnesota, in my view, this is a local decision. Intelligent design is something that, in my view, is plausible and credible and something that I personally believe in. But more importantly, from an educational and scientific standpoint, it should be decided by local school boards, but at the local school district level.
So the same sort of, you know, talking about evolution in terms of belief rather than in terms of as a scientific idea, contrasting it, equal time, both sides. You see the same thing here. Here's Michelle Bachman.
Should intelligent design be taught along with evolution in science classes in public schools?
I think that all science should be on the table, and wherever science leads, that's where it leads. I think
is intelligent design science?
Well, again, let me answer. I think the one thing we do not want to have is censorship by government. Government shouldn't be dictating what information goes on the table in the area of intelligent design that you're asking about. There's a couple of issues that have to be dealt with. The issue of irreducible complexity, for instance, that has to be addressed. When a cell gets to its absolute minimum level of composition, how did that occur? What are the origins of life? And if the question comes in for intelligent design, I don't think that it should be excluded by government or censored by government because of a preconceived notion by government. I'm a Christian. I gave my life to Jesus Christ when I was 16 years of age. The beautiful thing about the United States is that we are based upon determination, and it's up to the states what they want to determine, and even more importantly, what the local school system determines. But my opinion goes with science. And whatever science finds, I think that information, questions as well as responses, needs to be laid on the table so that students can make up their mind. It shouldn't be government telling students. Students should make up their mind.
So what I'm drawing from your answer, is that intelligent design is indeed you consider to be science and should be taught alongside evolution in science classes.
What I'm saying is that the local school systems need to make that decision. I will tell you what I believe. I do believe that God created the earth. And I believe that there are issues that need to be addressed. The second law of thermodynamics, the issue of irreducible complexity, the dearth of the fossil record. Those are all very real issues that should be addressed in science classes. But again, I'm not going to make that decision as president. I wouldn't begin to. Those are the decisions that need to be made by parents, local school boards, and also the departments of education.
And so here again, a theme that you saw in the Miss USA thing, the idea of evolution as the origin of life, which is really a separate issue, but treating it as if that's what it was about, rather than the origins of biological diversity, right? And also this idea of local control, that it's something that people should be able to make up their own minds. It should be left to local school districts or to individual kids to decide what they want to believe, which is not a standard we really apply to anything else. It's not like kids can be like, well, I don't hold with this whole infinite limits thing, so that calculus isn't for me, right? No. Calculus, just you teach it and you learn it, and there it is. Here's a comment from Rick Perry on the camp right when he got into the race, briefly.
I'm not sure
if it goes back a long, long way.
Completely and absolutely how long. Your mom was asking about evolution. And, it's a theory that is out there. It's got some gaps in it. In Texas, we teach both creationism and evolution in our school.
Ask him why he doesn't take the science.
Because I figure you're smart enough to figure out which one is right.
This is like an 8-year-old, right? So he's saying, oh, I think you're smart enough to figure out, what's right and what's wrong about this scientific topic, right? It's sort of weird. And then Ron Paul.
It's a theory of evolution, and I don't accept it, as a theory. But I think the creator that I know, created us, every one of us, and created the universe, and the precise time and manner, and all. I just don't think we're at the point where anybody has absolute truth on either side.
So again, setting up that contrast between evolution and religion.
Was he on?
You have to repeat it because people cannot.
Oh, sorry. So he basically says, yeah, evolution's a theory that's out there, but I personally reject it because I'm Christian and that's not my faith. I have a clip here from Newt Gingrich, but it's sort of, and Rick Santorum, but that sort of, it goes weird directions. But this was a famous comment that you may have seen covered at the time that it was issued. John Huntsman tweeted early on in the campaign, this was in August, "To be clear, I believe in evolution and trust scientists on global warming. Call me crazy." By the end of the campaign, but before he had to drop out of the race, he had sort of changed course on global warming and had started to say, well, there are scientists who think both ways on it, and so I don't know what I think anymore. But so the question that all of this leaves me with, clearly, the politicians are not just out there on their own, and neither they nor necessarily, in all cases at least, I mean, some of the Miss USA responses are are just obviously ignorant. There's this stare into the headlights of the camera like, what are you asking me? But I mean, a lot of them do seem to have firm opinions about it, but not necessarily well grounded in the science. So how does something that's scientifically uncontroversial like evolution become so politically controversial? And to understand that, we sort of have to go back to the 19 teens and 20s with the birth of the idea of fundamentalism. And this is something people don't always realize. Fundamentalism starts with a book, or a volume of books called The Fundamentals. The first volume when it came out in 1909. And that's where the word fundamentalism comes from. So fundamentalism as a phenomenon is a 20th century American phenomenon. It spread beyond that, obviously, but if people talk about, oh, you know, fundamentalism in the 19th century, it's ahistoric, right? It's a modern phenomenon. It's a response to developments in biblical interpretation, as well as to scientific and technological changes in society that were happening around then. And so these were invited volumes of theological commentary from conservative theological writers of the day that were collected together into a multi-volume set, ultimately. And when you look at those early volumes, they weren't uniformly anti-evolution. There was a lot of anti-evolution sentiment in them, but in some of the essays were completely fine with evolution. Others of them would say, well, this natural selection mechanism, that makes sense, that's fine, but this whole common ancestry thing, we don't hold with that. That's unbiblical. And others of the essays say, that whole common ancestry thing, yeah, that makes sense, that's totally fine, there's no theological problem there, but this natural selection mechanism, I have a problem with that. So there's a range of views there in the birth of fundamentalism that went away within about 20 years. And the major event was the Scopes trial. So this is John Scopes, the substitute teacher who was ultimately tried and convicted of violating a Tennessee law that said you may not teach any theory that denies the story of divine creation of man as taught in the Bible. Whether he actually did that is open to debate. They never called him as a witness because it wasn't totally clear. He remembered that he taught from the book, and the book included evolution. So he sort of said, yeah, sure, I guess. I probably, you know, maybe, why not? And he was figuring on leaving the school district anyway, so it wasn't, you know, if he got convicted, that wasn't the end of the world. But they never called him as a witness because if he was called to the stand and actually asked, did you actually violate the law? In all honesty, he could not have said, yes, definitely. And both sides wanted to convict him so that they could appeal it and have a test case. And for various reasons, his conviction was overturned for technical grounds, or at least not the conviction, the punishment. The $100 fine was overturned, but the conviction wasn't, and the law was never challenged on constitutional grounds. The trial judge didn't let them do that, and in the appellate courts, it didn't work out for them to be able to do that. So the law in Tennessee and in other states stayed on the books through the 60s. And you know, famously, William Jennings Bryan prosecuted Scopes there. He had pushed for that law in Tennessee and for similar laws and resolutions in other states. In his native Florida, where he had retired after, this is from his 1896 presidential campaign. He ran for president 5 times. He was Secretary of State to Woodrow Wilson, resigned in protest over the entry into World War II, or World War I. I mean, you know, and so after he did that, he took on prohibition as a cause. And once he passed prohibition, he needed something else to do. And so he took on evolution. And he went on these tours around the country. He was this famous orator. People would come from miles, you know, tens of thousands of people would show up in outdoor venues before artificial amplification, right, to hear him speak. They probably couldn't actually hear him, but his charisma was so great that they just wanted to be present at the moment, right? And so once he started talking about evolution, theologically not quite a fundamentalist, but sort of aligned with fundamentalists in various ways, it became this defining trait that people felt like they had to line up one way or the other with respect to Bryan and with respect to evolution. He made it into this matter of cultural identity, that if you were a fundamentalist, you had, or if you were a particular sort of Christian, you had to reject evolution. That regardless of what your opinion on the science was, if you were a good person, this is what you did. Later on, in the 1960s, during the space race and a recognition that it actually mattered what happened in science education, the textbooks changed. After the Scopes trial, evolution sort of drifted away from a lot of the textbooks because they knew that those laws were on the books. But evolution came back in the 60s, and another substitute, or a young teacher, Susan Epperson, challenged the Arkansas version of the Scopes era law and said, you know, this is absurd. And the Supreme Court agreed. creationism evolved, you had creation science. This is a triceratops with a saddle on its back from the Answers in Genesis Creation Museum in Kentucky. And their idea is that rather than saying you can't teach evolution because it's against the Bible, to say, well, look, here's all this scientific evidence that totally shows that the Earth is 6,000 years old and that there was a global flood and that people rode around on dinosaurs.
We have about 2 minutes left.
Okay.
Do you want to take questions?
Sure. Yeah. I'll wind down.
We can take 15 actually.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, so here you've got some of the expert witnesses who were called in a 1982 case in Arkansas challenging a creation science law there, which called for equal time for evolution and creationism. If you were going to teach evolution, that's fine, you're allowed, but you have to give equal time to the other side, right? It's that same rhetoric. It's deeply embedded in the American psyche, right? And the same thing with intelligent design later on. The idea that, you know, so here's the famous intelligent design textbook that was published and that was at issue in the Dover trial in 2005 in Dover, Pennsylvania. When during the trial, early drafts of the textbook came out. And so it was possible to look back. There were drafts going back to 1983. The Supreme Court case on creation science came in 1987. And so you can do a word count on how often the word creationism or versions of the word creationism or intelligent design show up in the drafts. And the blue line at the bottom is intelligent design. You know, maybe a handful of references, but hundreds, you know, over 100 references to creationism. And there's a draft from early 1987, from before the Supreme Court case, where that trend holds. And then the Supreme Court case comes. And they just did a search and replace, and didn't quite get it right always. There's one place in that first draft that talks about could design proponentsists, where they tried to take out creationists and replace it with design proponents, and just missed a little bit, left the C at the beginning and the ists at the end, which was one of the lines of evidence that led the judge in that case to, again, find that intelligent design is not science, is a religious idea and doesn't have a place in classrooms. But the point is that despite all of the changes in science and in law and so forth, here's the superintendent of public instruction in California in 1925 was asked during the Scopes trial, what about in California? What's the law here? And he said it's fine to teach evolution as long as it's taught as a theory, not as a fact. This was Bryan's rhetoric. It was standard line through the time. And here in Florida in 2008, they revised their science standards. And before they would approve these new science standards that added, the word evolution did not occur in the old standards in Florida until 2008. The new standards added the word evolution, added a wonderful coverage of the topic. But before the State Board of Education would approve it, they had to insert the word scientific theory of in front of every reference to it. It had to be taught as a theory, not as a fact. So for as much as things change, creationism really does stay the same. So what do we do to get the finger? Why don't people hear the science? Why don't people understand what's going on? Part of what happens is that how scientists and folks like us here think about evolution is different than how the general public does. As I think the Miss USA comments reveal, we tend to think, you know, we've got the fossils, here's Tiktaalik crawling out of the mud, showing how evolution works, and on the ground there you've got a shoe that says creationism. Tiktaalik has eaten up creationism. We've got the missing link. We can show how evolution works. Whereas creationists look at fossils and say, hey, for last time, stop following me. I'm a creationist. It's not about the scientific evidence. And we talk at NCSE about the pillars of science denial. You see this with evolution. You see it with climate change. The idea that you attack the science. Here's William Jennings Bryan doing that in the Scopes era, saying, you know, of the two laws of evolution, sexual selection has been laughed out of the classroom and natural selection has been abandoned, and no new explanation is satisfactory even to scientists. You see people saying the same thing today, that it's, you know, evolution is on its way out, people don't take it seriously anymore, natural selection is gone. In 1982, the law at issue in the McLean trial said that one of the things that creation science had to cover was the idea that of the insufficiency of mutation and natural selection to bring about development of all living things from a single organism. Again, the idea that evolution is weak, it can't explain what we see around us in the world. The second pillar is the idea that the moral consequences of the idea, that if the result of believing in evolution, not the first, I tend to say accepting evolution. I believe that, you know, the Cubs are the greatest team in baseball. I accept the theory of gravity. Doesn't matter whether I believe in gravity, right? And so here's Henry Morris, the founder of creation science, saying that evolution is at the foundation of communism, fascism, Freudianism, social Darwinism, behaviorism, Kinseyism, materialism, atheism, and in the religious world, modernism and neo-orthodoxy. In view of the bitter fruit yielded by the evolutionary system over the past 100 years, a closer look at the nature of the tree itself is well warranted today. So the idea is that we should reject whatever scientific evidence there may exist on evolution because it leads to bad consequences. Bad things happen if people believe that evolution is right. And here's a similar argument that was from the 60s. This is from the 80s. You've got the tree of biological evolution there on the trunk, soaking up from the roots sin through the ground of unbelief, and producing the fruits of philosophical evolution, including things like crime, secularism, abortion, mom, child, lib, hard rock, and so forth. Inflation. And so the solution, of course, is for the axe there of scientific creationism to chop down the tree of biological evolution, thus ridding the world of all of these evil fruits. Right? This is not how I tend to think about it, right? It's probably not how you tend to think about it, but it is how you see that in the responses from the Miss USA contestants. You see it from politicians. This idea that it's a matter of belief, that it's in competition with religion or with religious morality, and that, you know, it's a philosophy, and that you should treat it as a philosophy, and that philosophies that have bad results should perhaps be sort of sidelined. And the third pillar is this idea of fairness, equal time. It's only fair to let kids make up their own minds. It's only fair, William Jennings Bryan argued, to let taxpayers decide what's taught in their own local schools. Right? This is what we were hearing from these politicians. This idea of fairness is so foundational to American democracy and the American psyche that we should be able to determine for ourselves how this works. And creationism plays right into that. So here you have from a Discovery Institute publication talking about how intelligent design might be integrated into public school science, saying we shouldn't teach a single theoretical viewpoint, and we shouldn't ignore scientific dissent and parental concerns about dogmatism. This is that same idea of equal time and fairness. I was going to wrap up talking a little bit about NCSC's new work on climate change, but in view of time, I will skip that and just do two last little slides. One, making a point about what can we do? And we were talking about Darwin Day earlier, and certainly participating in Darwin Day and other events like that. Science cafes. I'm a member of Bay Area Skeptics, which has events in the South San Francisco and in Berkeley. There are other groups around that do similar things. Talk to people in the schools. Make sure that they know that. Make sure that you know if you've got kids in schools, what are they being taught? Let the teachers know that they've got support from the community to teach evolution. Because a lot of times teachers who come to us at NCSE and are getting pressure not to teach evolution don't know whether there's anybody in the community around them. I'm guessing this is not so much an issue in Palo Alto, but we had a anti-climate change denialism flare up in Portola Valley not too long ago. There's no, and weird stuff comes up in Berkeley sometimes. There was a teacher who got in trouble, a third grade teacher who got in trouble for saying that evolution and Santa Claus were both myths. And it was her first year, and she didn't, during her probationary period, so didn't get hired again. And I don't know whether she got fired because she was telling third graders that Santa Claus didn't exist or evolution. It's hard to know, but it resolved. But I mean, it happens in the Bay Area too. Watch in the media. If you see newspaper reporters treating that same idea that, you know, here are just things that people should be able to make up their own mind. The evidence, you know, just let everyone decide on their own what the evidence is. That's not what journalists should be doing. They should be you know, truth vigilantes, as the New York Times ombudsman put it. So, you know, all these sorts of things, and just, you know, remind people, help build that support in the community. And ultimately, you know, let's have more people like former Miss California, Miss USA, currently from San Mateo, who said, hey, you didn't hear this because the volume was down. But her answer was, I was taught evolution in my high school growing up, and I believe it. I'm a huge science geek, so I like to believe in the Big Bang Theory, the evolution of humans throughout time. That's a good answer. I'm happy with that. And so that's our contact information if you want more, and I'm happy to take questions. I don't want to keep anyone from lunch if need be, though.
Our lunch is ready. Would you like to take a few minutes for questions, or what would you like to do? Okay, we'll take some questions.
Okay, I see 3 running up here, so I can start out.
So I understand that we shouldn't teach the story of creationism in school. Is that?
I think context matters. So in a social studies class or a history class, if someone wants to talk about or in a comparative religions class, to talk about the different ways that different religious groups have addressed these sorts of questions, or the historical context of the Scopes trial, certainly in that context, you have to talk about creationism. You have to teach about it. But to advocate it in a public school classroom would be a violation of church-state separation. You're endorsing a sectarian religious view there, not even one that's shared by all Christians, let alone by all citizens. And there's in a science class, there's the additional problem that if you present creationism there alongside evolution, you're mishandling. It's not just introducing misinformation about evolution, because a lot of the creationist arguments are basically some form of an attack on evolution, usually based on sort of not quite accurate accounts of what evolution necessarily says. But it also gives a misunderstanding of how science works, because you're presenting non-science in the science classroom at an impressionable age when kids haven't quite figured out where that line is. Does that? Okay. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Carl, and I have a question just sort of along the same lines. Your data asked the question, should evolution be taught in school? And you just said, because that's what my belief is, in biology class, no. In some other classes, maybe, right? But you don't have any data around the actual, should it be taught in biology, which to me is a big concern, as opposed to comparative religion or whatever other kind of hocus pocus people can put together. What's your thoughts on? That's what a lot of those people were saying.
Right, and because a lot of them perceive evolution not as a science issue, but as this sort of philosophical or cultural, it's become this issue, not just, certainly in the fundamentalist subcommunity, but that's influenced how society as a whole often treats evolution. I don't know, you don't tend to see surveys asking questions that specific, because people don't necessarily, are not necessarily going to have fixed opinions about where it belongs in the curriculum. Certainly when you ask a question in a specifically scientific context, what do you think about evolution, or should evolution be taught? If you've asked a bunch of other science questions first, you tend to get more support than if you start off by asking people what they think about abortion and stem cells and other cultural hot button topics, and then you come to evolution. So how you set that stage matters. So presumably, yeah, you get more support for teaching it as in a science class than you might have for teaching it elsewhere in the curriculum. But I'm not aware of any data on that.
Hello, John Carpenter. Well, I just happen to be a Bible reading agnostic, and I look at Genesis and I see couple legends right at the beginning of them, origins lessons. The first one has the 7 days of creation. The second one has Adam and Eve, and it is so curious that the second chapter in Genesis starts in the last sentence of the first story, and I wonder why it started there. Maybe it's to confuse, but something about King James, but and state religion might have did a little swizzling. The Torah didn't do that. It didn't even have chapter numbers. It had paragraphs.
Right.
So the second story started correctly. But when in my Methodist Sunday school class, well, they said, well, the 7 days was a figure of speech. It's, you know, who in the heavens knows? It might be millions of years. Who in the heavens knows about, you know, what goes on about 2,000 or 3,000 years ago? So of course they make up stories for children. So your comment on that?
Sure. I mean, I think certainly one of the things that inspired the rise of fundamentalism was the idea of going back. People were starting to take the biblical text and read it the way you would read Homer. You know, you look at the Odyssey and you don't say, well, this is meant to be an accurate account of navigating through the Mediterranean. That, you know, the ancient Greeks actually necessarily thought Scylla and Charybdis were there. It was a story. And aspects of it may have drawn on real history or oral traditions and other things, but it was in the late 19th century when people started to apply that same sort of literary criticism approach to the history of the Bible that started to freak people out. And fundamentalism was a reaction back against that more academic approach to theology. So yeah.
I think we're going to cut the questions off here.
Okay.
I would like to thank you very much. It's been a very interesting topic, I think.
And thank you all for coming out. I appreciate it.